That's great. So yeah, I mean, we're gonna kind of just kick it off. We're gonna do something a little bit more informal. I was talking to Nathan. I don't even know if we're gonna end up releasing the episode tonight. We'll see kind of how it flows and fits. So um, yeah. So what are your thoughts so far going back and rereading it?
Well, I thought you made a great point on the episode about like how long it really is. You really do think it's like, oh well, they just left a week after Gandalf tells them at first, hey, this ring, don't go in the fire, don't do anything, just make sure you have all your plans ready, and then you find out, oh, it was like 10 years later or something like that. You're like, oh, that's a long time.
It seems like it's a matter of days or at most a week initially in the movie, because he goes and we have the montage, but there's nothing that suggests a passage of time to that extent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's been your favorite part so far?
I think again, just like how much detail he draws into just like the life of the hobbits and how they they really weren't supposed to really be this main character. Even in Sauron's eyes, you hear that about the whole, well, he hasn't known about who the hobbits were and Bilbo, and then now that he has this ring, now he's finally been drawing his attention to the Shire, and all their world is pretty much to be upside down. And I was like, yeah, I mean, it really is. It's a kiss from the most unlikeliest of heroes.
Yeah.
Story.
Yep. What's up, Kyle?
Hey, Kyle, how's it going, man?
Fantastic. How are you
doing? Doing well.
Good.
I was just saying, man, I'm behind on my Lord of the Rings trilogy, like trivia. I haven't watched Lord of the Rings in forever.
That's all right. We're all in different phases of it, so it'll be good.
I mean, when it came out, I probably did like half a dozen times on each extended version, but
I think that's probably the movie I saw the most times in the theater, the original Fellowship of the Ring. And it was one of those deals. It wasn't, I mean, it was a great movie, but it wasn't necessarily because, I've got to see it a ton of times. But the very first time I was in college, and there's a bunch of guys had friends who were like threading up the reel the first night before it actually released. That was back before the movies came out at midnight. So we went up and did that. And then the next day, everyone was like, want to go again? Want to go again? I'm like, this movie's 3 hours long, man.
You want to go again?
Oh, too funny. Yeah, I think actually the first movie that I did that with was Avengers. I don't think I think Lord of the Rings, it was one of those things because it came out when we were on Christmas break.
Yeah.
So I went and saw it, I think, a couple times, and then the next movie that kind of came out that had a real pull to it was Avengers. I think I saw that like 4 or 5 times in theaters, but it was the same thing. People were like, "Hey, have you seen this yet?" "Yeah, I've seen it, but I'll go see it again."
Yes, you end up watching it. And I think what happened with Fellowship of the Ring is when Nathan and I might have been talking to this a little bit last. What happened when it came out the first time is there weren't any real fantasy movies hadn't come out for years. So the people who were fans of fantasy movies went to see it, but everyone else was like this nerd stuff. It took them like a while to get. I remember convincing a lot of people, like I gave them the book and like read the book, and then suddenly they were like, "Let's go see the movie." No, let's go see it again. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, for real. But that's what's interesting. I wanted to ask this to you guys. Is that like when Lord of the Rings came out, it was like a super cultural moment because it was like the first mainstream, like big fantasy series that was so successful and so popular. And they're ready to come out with this Amazon series. And, since Lord of the Rings, we've had we've had Game of Thrones, we've had Chronicles of Narnia and all these other series and movies and all. Is this next Lord of the Rings series going to be as impactful as like the first trilogy, especially since its characters we don't know and everything?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it depends on where they go with the story. I think if they try to do something like what Star Wars did with The Mandalorian, where we're getting a whole different saga that's unknown to us, I would say probably not. I think you're just going to end up annoying a lot of fans. But I think if they look into the Silmarillion and they start to pull some characters and try to pull some history and adapt from that, I think they could then retain the essence of what was done. But I think just trying to go in a different direction and say, hey, we're just going to come up with a new story and we're going to put Lord of the Rings on it, they're going to have a mess on their hands.
Game of Thrones, but we call it Lord of the Rings.
Well,
Right.
yeah, and I think that's the question about, is it going to be as impactful? I don't really see how it could unless they make it completely different. Unless they really try to make it more like Tolkien's book, so there's like 10 breakfasts and multiple musical numbers, which people may not. It might be groundbreaking in the wrong way, because love it or hate it, I think that probably Game of Thrones was the impactful moment on television for this, to prove that this kind of fantasy thing could fly. And my concern would be that they end up doing what a lot of TV shows, I don't think The Mandalorian's guilty of this, but what a lot of the shows have done, which is try to cater to the edginess of Game of Thrones. You know, that every fantasy series that comes on television or comes on Netflix or wherever has to have this level of edge to it. That edge even sort of infected like some of the early, like when they did Star Trek Discovery. It's like, I don't need my Star Trek to be this dark. I don't want Twilight Zone to be like Black Mirror, you know. So I think if they go that route with Lord of the Rings, that's a complete mistake, just because of the kind of tone and the kind of material that it is. I don't know. I don't see how it could be as impactful unless they really tried to make it like some kind of weird fantasy history series, you know, like they almost tried to take a historical fiction bent with it, which would be in keeping with Tolkien. But I just don't know. My interest has waned a little bit because for one thing, I don't know about you guys. I'll defer to your other three in this. One of the things about the Fellowship of the Ring for me, now some of the people who had never seen it were seeing it for the first time, like this is the first time they encountered the story, but was wanting to see the Shire and wanting to see Gandalf and all of these characters realized. I didn't just want to see a random fantasy story. Yes, we hadn't had one in a while, but it wasn't like I wanted to see that. I wanted to specifically see this fantasy world that was brought to life with these characters I knew. To me, the best parts, I think Fellowship is the best movie, not because it has the most action, but because it lingers so long in that world that you feel like you are a part of it. By the time Two Towers and Return of the King are happening, I was just like, slow down just a little bit, guys. I just want to see a little bit more what's going on. The battles are cool, but you know, can't we hang out a little bit of more Gondor when it's not getting sacked or something like that? And that's hard because I mean that's the nature of the books, or nature of the movies. But I don't see why I hope to be surprised, much like The Mandalorian, but I don't see how it will be kind of like what you're saying. I don't see how it could be groundbreaking unless they really pull out the stops. They're going to have to deliver something really special that I would have to say probably either demonstrates that they can do the drama thing the way Game of Thrones did for I don't say a family, but more of a general audience. That's about the only way I could see it being as effective.
I think they're gonna go more for like Marvel, but Lord of the Rings style, like that level of like humor, comedy, like all age groups type of thing. But Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. What do you think, Jared?
I think they could do something pretty similar. I mean, I've heard, aren't they supposed to be doing the Silmarillion, supposedly? Like, I think they got the rights to that. But
I don't think that the Tolkien estate has released the rights to the Silmarillion. I think what they've done is they've kind of given up the time frame and said, hey, this is the time frame where this is going to take place. But I don't know that they've actually given up the rights to the Silmarillion in order to allow that to happen.
Yeah. See, that could be an issue. I mean, even since they're having the Game of Thrones writers on there, it kind of makes me reticent. I really hope that they don't try to make it over-sexualized or over, try to make it like the next Game of Thrones. Because I don't think even the, limited family of Tolkien would appreciate that very much. So, I mean, yeah. And also, so I kind of read the books after I watched the movies. So but to me, I saw my dad when I was very young, and we both kind of thought that the Fellowship was probably the worst movie out of the three, because again, you're so long and set everything up, which I understand it's a world building movie, but it almost seems like it almost takes too long to build that world. And then, you know, when it's 3 hours long, you're like, okay, let's get somewhere. Show me. And so that's my thoughts on it. That's just, yeah, it's a tedious movie, but you know, I understand why it is.
Yeah. The one thing that I would be interested for them to do in the series is, I think you could take some of the stories and expand on the universe. Like I said, I mean, the thing about the Silmarillion is that most of the things that are mentioned and touched upon are found in pieces in the Lord of the Rings, and so they could draw from that source material. But you have things that would be, I think, really fascinating to see, like the fall of Numenor, to see, okay, where did Aragorn's lineage come from, and what was it like there? And you know, that's where Sauron actually loses his body, and he can never take his you know, the shape where he could appeal to people again. You know, that's where he becomes the Dark Lord. And so I think there's a lot of things that they could do with it. It's just, you know, like you guys are saying, are we going to find ourselves with, you know, Avengers in Middle Earth, or are we going to find ourselves with Game of Thrones in Middle Earth? Or
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think another thing is right now they're going to hire people that did something very similar, right? Like you're talking, okay, Game of Thrones writers are going to bring these people in. And we were mentioning this last time on the podcast that one of the things that you kind of forget about Fellowship of the Ring is that it basically is a adventure story that isn't trying to be a fantasy, because fantasy is a genre that what we think of as high fantasy doesn't exactly exist. Like it sort of does, but you either got fairy tales or things like that. So you have Tolkien putting together something because he's a passion for kind of something else, right? Like he has a passion for language, he's a passion for world building, but he's not necessarily, I love dragons and elves and things like that. He likes history and mythology, and he brings those together. Then we have Peter Jackson, who only had made like splattery horror films at the point when he picks up Fellowship of the Ring. Well, that, and there was a like a true crime movie he did called Heavenly Creatures. He made a lot of weird little New Zealand movies. They're all pretty good if you enjoy that kind of thing, which I do. But like the thing is, he wasn't the guy that on paper you would say, let's direct this fantasy series that we want to aim at families and open big. I mean, he did a whole movie with Muppets that had like syphilis and were murdering each other and, you know, smoking drugs and stuff. So, I mean, on paper, but the thing is, I guess my point is they picked someone who had a passion for the material that was coming from outside their wheelhouse. They were bringing a lot of other things with them. They were creative and interesting, but they weren't necessarily. He wasn't hired because he had just made Dragonheart or something like that, right? Like he wasn't making some sort of fantasy movie. And I think when you look at like, you know, George Lucas, just this past weekend I showed my kids American Graffiti, right? Like the things that George Lucas did prior to Star Wars, he did a sci-fi movie, but it was more of a dystopian kind of thing, THX 1138. But like, I think that's the thing is nowadays we don't seem to go for the person who's interesting because they're creative and come up with new ideas. We want someone who is proven they can do the thing we want them to do. Very rarely does that result in, I think, something astonishing. It might be good, it might work, but I would almost be interested in see them pick somebody that's more a little bit of a, not a wild card, but someone that proved, hey, I have a passion. I really want to tell this part of the Lord of the Rings story. The problem is, right, what I see on paper right now is they're like, Game of Thrones did great. Lord of the Rings is something people like. Let's make something.
Yeah.
There's a lot more competition in the field now than when the original Lord of the Rings movies came out. Like there's, you know, the Witcher series, you know, Netflix is doing live action Chronicles of Narnia series. Amazon has the rights to to the Wheel of Time. You know, just tons of stuff that's coming out. Like even just in mainstream movies and stuff, you've got like the Avatar 4 films that are coming out of it.
Have they been coming out for the past 10 years, supposedly? Will we ever see that? I'm not in a hurry either, but I mean,
$1 billion for 4 movies. Oh.
Yeah, I mean, I had fun at the first one, but I wasn't one I was really clamoring for a sequel.
But that's what, like, those, it's kind of like the same crowd. The people who go see Avatar are kind of like similar people who go see, Lord of the Rings TV series or the Witcher TV series and all. And so there's a lot more competition in the marketplace. And I think people are more, they're not just like, I'll take this because it's the only thing here. Like, this is the only, big, movie of this scale in the fantasy era. Now they're more like more of a sophisticated audience. You know what I mean?
Peter Jackson already learned that when he came back. And actually, that's a good point, because you look at Peter Jackson, he comes back and he does The Hobbit after he does these 3 movies, and all of the things that he had learned from his little horror movies and how to make things economical and keep the story moving, he lost somewhere between there and when he got to The Hobbit. And now he's just a guy who had made a popular fantasy series before, and it kind of blew up on. I mean, I've seen those movies. I'm not a huge fan of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the transition, Jared, between his role in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit? Have you seen the Hobbit series?
Unfortunately, yes. Yes. I saw, so I thought the first 2 were great.
Mhm.
I mean, well, not great, but okay. This is where The Hobbit, boy, you did what you had to do. But the third one's just so unnecessary. It's like one big battle scene. You're like, I paid like $7 to rent that. I'm like, well, this was a waste of $7 because what purpose did it serve? It didn't move anything. Versus, I mean, you're right. And what he did with Lord of the Rings, it was, he served the story well. He learned how, move the story along, albeit like at some peril. But yeah, I mean, it was just like, it almost came off like as a cash grab after Lord of the Rings. It's like, okay.
Let's take this one book, split it into 3 books, and
That was, I know that originally, before Jackson had come back to it, several different people had tried to do it, and then Del Toro had been assigned at one point, and I would have been very interested to see what he would have done with one single movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I mean, and I feel that you could do The Hobbit in one movie. I don't think that would have been an issue at all. But even if you were going to say, okay, we're going to split it into 2, I think would have been, a better, it would have served the story better than if you were going to try to say, okay, let's take The Hobbit and let's divide it into these 3 parts. You realize by the end of the 3 hours in The Hobbit that, wait a minute, I'm only here. You're basically, I think you're about halfway through the book at that point, and then you get to, and then it's like, wait, we still have 2 more movies in this. How are we going to do that? Where, I feel like, and I feel like The Hobbit, the first one, was actually done very well. I feel like when I read through the book, that The Hobbit and the book, The Hobbit, the movie, they line up really well up until that point. And then you get to the second one and you're like, all right, we're starting to deviate. And by the end of the second one, you're like, wait, we're just throwing characters in here who've never been in here in scenes. And
right.
Then you get to the third one and you're like, wait, you could have resolved this story in 10 minutes.
Yeah. And he runs into something that's very strange, which is that despite all of the 3 movies he's got, some things still get very short shrift. Like, why does the character Bjorn get so few lines and sequences when there are now 3 movies to account for him, and they still crowd him out? The guy who can shapeshift into a bear, he's barely in that series. It's just astonishing to me that's
we ran out of time. I don't know what,
right. The guy that was in the original book can't fit because
we had to invent these other new characters.
Right, we needed to have some elf hobbit or elf dwarf romance, and there's that Rock'em Sock'em's robot scene in the first one where the 2 mountains are throwing boulders at each other or something.
Yeah. I think the benefit that this TV series has, though, is that it doesn't have to be directly profitable because it's coming out under Amazon. It's not HBO. HBO is very tied to people signing up. But if you get a small portion of people signing up for Amazon just because of Lord of the Rings, then those people are ordering off their website and they're getting money in other ways. And so it doesn't have to be as, the demands on the series aren't as great as they would if they were coming out under HBO or a traditional TV network.
Yeah, and that's a good point. That's kind of what we've seen some of these others do, where it's like, let's commit, tell an interesting story, and let's do what we're going to do, and we'll see how everyone responds to it. To some degree, I feel like that's kind of what they did with Picard with CBS. It's like, okay, we're just gonna we'll put it out there, we'll go for it, but I don't necessarily know that there were so many hands in the pot that they were micromanaged to a great degree with it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna interject for a second here, because we're getting more people on. Let's go ahead and if you're not talking, just mute your mics so that way we don't get some background noise and things like that. And then when you want to talk, just unmute your mic. Tricks of the trade, Chip, I know you've been doing the online teaching thing for several weeks now too, so I'm sure you get it. So yeah, and then to get Chip caught up on what we were talking about, obviously we kind of started with Fellowship, and then we digressed into Amazon and The Hobbit. So Chip, you just recently went through and reread The Fellowship, right? What were your thoughts on?
Okay, thanks. As long as you've got it. Thoughts on a couple of things resounded to me. I hadn't read it in quite a number of years, probably 18 or 20 years. And the first thing I thought after I got back into it again was just how well written the story is. He did not waste words, even though it's a 1,500-page tome, with the first one being, about 400 in the version I have. I didn't feel like many words were wasted. The characters are introduced in a way that you get to know them almost immediately in some form or fashion. And then the characters are well drawn as you go through the story. So that was my initial thought on the book. And interestingly, about how timely it is. It hasn't gotten old at all. It's aged well. It's earned its status as a classic. I know some have listed it as the best book of the 1900s. Kind of hard to dispute that, but I'm sure that could be another long discussion. But then we also rewatched the movie last week. We watch them annually, my wife and I together. We stretch it out. And we have wrapped in The Hobbit, but we can talk about that again. But just really how well I thought the movie, and you guys talked about it in your podcast last week, really did a fine job at setting the tone for their characters. The overall tone of the story, I felt, was captured quite well in the movie. Always did. I mean, I remember watching it the first time and in the theater over at White Marsh, actually. And you're watching the introduction come up on screen and how they introduce it, and they go through the poem, and then you hear Gollum say, "My precious." And as soon as I heard that vocalization, I thought, I think Jackson got it. Because that was very similar to the voice I had in my head. The downside, which is mixed now, I'm also into The Two Towers as well, rereading that. The downside is all the voices I hear now are the movies. So I've lost that wonder of the first time you read it when you build your own characters. That said, I felt the characterizations were so good, I've gotten where I don't mind that. Gandalf speaks, I hear Ian McKellen. Frodo is Elvin Wood. So it works, Elijah Wood. It's worked well overall. So the two I thought fit together right well. Obviously, stuff is left out. I think you talked in the podcast about Bombadil, Tom Bombadil. That would have been a fun character to see on screen. And my guess is they'll cover that well in the Amazon series when that's ready to go. And I appreciated the thoughts somebody brought out about that. Looking forward to that as well. So those are, in brief, what I captured in the rereading of it.
Nice. Let me ask Kyle and Jared, based on what you guys remember, what were some of the impressions you had from what you remember from the book of things that you were excited about seeing on screen versus things that you were like, man, I wish they hadn't done that, and maybe they should have put that in instead or done that differently. What are your thoughts on that? Jared, let's go ahead and start with you, and then we'll bump it to Kyle.
I think you know, the way you first see Aragorn, especially when you see Aragorn in the books, like, okay, this is a very interesting character, and just see how Jackson takes him, and he's first met the Prancing Pony, and he's just this almost like this Green Arrow like character where he's just all hooded and like, okay, I don't know anyone, I don't want you to know me, I'm just here, and then to see what he grows into at the end of the book, and then Rivendell, like, you know, the very end, to see the whole city and just how majestic and just how the elves live, and then you see Bilbo and you're like, oh hey, there's Bilbo. But yeah, those are things I was excited to see. Like I said, I had the extended edition, so I can't really think of much more they could have added. But yeah, those are my 2 cents.
I think for me, so complete honesty, I'm not one of those people who's read the book series like 100 times. I've read it one time. And when I actually read the books, I got to the end and I was just kind of ready for the series to be done. And so like, I was like, all right, they won the war. And I like just stopped reading. There were like, I don't know, 100 pages left. And the movies came out and The Last Return of the King came out. And my buddy goes, yeah, but I hate that they left out the part where they go back to the Shire and Sauron's there and he's taken over. I was like, what? That happened? This is what I get for not reading the last 50 pages of the book. And so I had to go back 5 years after I'd read it and go back and read it and be like, oh man, that was great. Like, this is why you always read to the end. But, they gave 3 books to The Hobbit, but they couldn't finish that part in. But I don't know how they would have. Return of the King was almost 4 hours at that point. So I like that. But I think the big thing was they hit it like right from the get-go. Like Shire was exactly as I pictured it. Hobbits were exactly as I pictured it. Like it was just, you stepped into it and it was like you were in that world and it was like, that was exactly as I pictured. Other stuff, maybe they did this differently or I kind of had it differently, but Shire I thought was spot on.
Oh, you got to unmute yourself,
Yeah.
Nathan.
I do this at work all the time. They're like, Nathan, what are your thoughts? Like, I just gave them to you, but you missed it. So it had that sensibility too that I feel like older movies had. When I say older, I'm thinking like Ben-Hur, Lawrence of Arabia, some of these big movies where even in 2001, special effects aren't where they are now. But even when the special effects were not necessarily 100% up to snuff, like for example, that scene when they're in the mines of Moria and you see Moria and it's just basically it's a digital matte painting, right? And when the goblins come up out of the ground, they still don't they're clearly like an army of CGI little people popping out of the ground. But the scale of it and the fact that Jackson keeps going back to scenes of people in actual armor and the goblins and the orcs are right there, that it still works. That's still such a great action scene. I watched it a couple nights ago and it's that, does it look real? No, but I appreciate that Jackson was willing to do things like that scene where they're on the bridge looks like they're standing on a small model. To this day, I watched a Ray Harryhausen movie with my kids the other day with the stop motion like dragon and the stop motion cyclops. I would watch stop motion in movies if they took and put the level of character and detail in. And I think that's what set those first few Lord of the Rings movies apart. By the time you got to The Hobbit, Jackson was doing stuff that looked like it belonged in a video game with Legolas running along. It looked like Mario Brothers and stuff. And it just, there was an integrity to the images and stuff in there. And people have been painting Lord of the Rings for years, right? Like images, and probably everybody's painted in their mind what it looks like. So I like that he was deferring and he got some of the artists like Greg Hildebrand, some of these other guys to actually do these illustrations. And so that first scene, Jared mentioned the scene where Aragorn is smoking his pipe there at the in the inn of the Prancing Pony, and the embers light up his eyes. You could easily see that as an illustration. And I think that they took the time to slow down and do all of that. Like so many things now aren't shots; they're just even the CGI armies and stuff in the very beginning of the movie are very well done. So I would like if they do something like that with the Amazon series. I'd very much be interested in it if they keep that same level of artistry to it. But again, you have to have someone who's passionate about Tolkien, not just passionate about making a fantasy story, I think.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and to your point, Nathan, too, I think one of the great things that that Jackson did in the first one, The Fellowship, was that he didn't always build up and use the CGI armies. You know, you go to the very end when they're, you know, on Amon Hen, and you have the army coming in to try to grab Frodo. You know, that's you're not getting all the CGI from that. You know, you're getting the people coming in right after the other, and he's using that shot in that scene very well. You know, it's kind of that throwback to Star Wars before, you know, Lucas was like, hey, let's set up the clone army and just make it all digital. You know, you're dealing with, okay, we're actually going to use people, and we're going to map this out and make sure that we are able to shoot this in such a way that it feels like you're looking at this grand army. And to me, that was one of the things about Jackson, was he was still new enough coming in that he had something to prove. And then by the time he got to The Hobbit, it was like, I don't have anything to prove now, and he didn't. Hmm.
Yeah, it was. They'll give me the money for special effects. I can get away with it.
Yeah, exactly. So we
And
talked.
yeah, I think you're right.
What were you going to say?
Sorry.
Nope, go ahead.
I think it was a similar lesson that they learned in Star Wars. I think that was an apt comparison. They went back to the prequels and they did all this digital stuff, and it like wasn't as great. And so then when they came back to do the sequel trilogy, they kind of tried to go back to a lot more of the animatronics and like just as much live action as possible. And so I hope they learn the same lesson with the TV series, and that they keep it as much live action as possible. You know, we don't see these the scene of them going down the river, jumping from barrel to barrel, just like, oh, that killed me. I couldn't stand that one, just because it was just the suspension of disbelief was too high for me. And that, I mean, we're in a fantasy world, but I still got to believe that they can jump from barrel to barrel on a moving river.
And then
Yeah.
jump out and then back in at some point.
Well, and I think too, you know, and I'm wondering if Jackson went more for that kind of silly tone to bring kids in a little bit more. You know, I mean, it was still PG-13, but you know, I feel like I'm watching that and I'm like, you know, monkeys in a barrel or whatever, just seeing them, you know, going through and going down. You know, it had more of that silly young child vibe to it than it did anything, you know, that you would see in Tolkien's world. You know, and I think that's the great thing about what Tolkien did in building his world is while it's fantastical, you know that there's something deeper going on behind it, that, you know, you still feel the danger for these characters. You feel like, you know, they could lose their life at any moment. Aragorn might be, you know, the chosen one to reclaim Gondor, but his life still isn't safe, you know, and you feel that danger all the way through to the end.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things The Hobbit, the problems with splitting into 3 stories is then you have to, and this is maybe the same challenge with the Amazon series, is then you have to come up with motivations and uh, character development for characters that maybe were only mentioned like they'd be mentioned in a fairy tale, right? Like a lot of that happens in the Silmarillion or a historical footnote. And if you're basing that off of a historical character, then you're good. Here in this case, the problem comes in, are we going to have writers that are just going to write kind of cliches, you know, which is what happened with The Hobbit, right? One of the things that's interesting about the Fellowship of the Ring is that most of the characters in the Fellowship of the Ring don't want to be doing the thing they're doing, meaning that everybody wants, you know, Aragorn's conflicted. He doesn't feel good in the beginning about being the king or having this legacy. He's not as conflicted in the book as he is in the film, but there's still this idea that everyone is sort of just doing what they have to do because of the situation they're in. They grow into the people that they are through being put through this situation. So none of them necessarily has like a big particularly in the books, this big arc that might have to do with lost love, or there's some of that, but a lot of that's been concocted even for the movies. So one of the things I think so strong about Tolkien's book is these people are relatable. They all have varying things going on with them, and a lot of times it doesn't have anything to do with, well, they look down on me in the Shire. Like I feel like now Frodo would have to be bullied or something, or uh, some kind of thing that he can overcome, other than just overcoming.
Social justice, Lord of the Rings.
Yes, right, exactly. But you see that kind of thing done in other, and even a little bit of that does start to happen in The Hobbit, because you got these whole characters. Do we need this elf dwarf romance that happens? And I'm not opposed to that, but it was handled in the most cliche sort of way, right? Like there was no real emphasis given to these characters, and I think that's one of the powerful things about the book is that there's a richness to every character, including Gollum, including these characters who come in for a little bit and then disappear. Tom Bombadil, I would be interested actually in seeing if they do bring him in the way you're suggesting, right? Because I think that would be cool. I don't know if they have the ability to do it the right way, because I think it's kind of such a light character that I wonder if they would know how to handle it. I don't think they understand. It's not a light character, but the way the character is presented is very jovial. He's from a different era completely. I just don't know that. I mean, look at Radagast the Brown. Like, I almost feel like that's in even trying to get close to that. That was almost a little embarrassing. Which was kind of a shame, because that actor who for a short period of time played Doctor Who in the 80s, I think he's a good actor. It just I don't think knew what they were doing there.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of true of many of the characters that they took from from The Hobbit, at least. Is I feel like Lord of the Rings, one of the things that really can't be doubted is the heart and essence of the book found its way into the movie with the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Is you see, like you were saying, Chip, those, you picture those characters in your head now. You see those voices, because regardless of how we pictured them before, they did such a good job at bringing those characters to life. And I think one of the things that what you said, Nathan Jackson, did was he went back and he studied the paintings. He studied the drawings that were made from the books. That Tolkien did a lot of that himself, and so we're getting the author's image. And Jackson took a lot of time to preserve some of those things and bring those things into the movie that we saw. And so, we can sit here and debate, on and off. Man, I want to see this character and I want to see this scene. Ultimately, I have this debate with a good friend of mine, where he's just throwing his hands up in the air. Oh man, they should have done this. And it's like, yeah, we can sit here and we could say they should have done A, B, C, D, X, Y, Z all we want, but at the end of the day, did the heart of that story come on the screen? And for me, when I look at it, it did. When I look at The Hobbit, I think the bowels came on the screen, from that story. There was nothing in there. And I do want to be fair, because I really did enjoy the first movie of The Hobbit, but where you took it and where it ended up was just a disaster. And so speaking of that, what would be something that from the story you would have loved to have seen made its way? Because I think those things are that makes this type of conversation fun, because the things that I'm thinking of and the things that you're thinking of, complete the story. For me, one of the things that I would have enjoyed seeing was Aragorn's character in the movie, I think, have a little bit more of that self-doubt, where in the book, I feel like he questions himself a lot more. The movie made him a much stronger character, much more decisive. This is where we're going. This is what we're doing. Where in the book, he was more unsure of himself, which I think added to when he finally rose up and took up the mantle of king and finally claimed his birthright, essentially. So Chip, you mentioned Bombadil. Sorry, what would be another scene?
That's a good question. I'm going to try to think through that a little more. I wanted to follow up on what you said about Aragorn, because you hit that in your podcast last week as well. Just that, and now being into the Two Towers, that characterization that you just mentioned is right, because he's real quick to lean Gandalf's direction or somebody else's direction if he thinks it's a good idea. He's a growing leader at the time. He just wants to do the right thing. He's not always sure what it is. And that is an aspect that I think did carry over into the film, that aspect of his character. But that's a good question. I wish I had skimmed the book again to see. I'll let some others jump in and try to come back on that one. And I had a couple other thoughts on The Hobbit I'll get back to later. So,
Nathan, jump over to you. What would be a scene that you can think of from the book that didn't quite make it, that you were like, I think this would have been a really fun addition to see in there?
I mean, there are a couple. I think the thing is, though, that they did a reasonable job of going through, and I think truncating what they could. To me, it's less about a major, because some of the things they did cut, like the Barrow-wights and things like that, it sort of makes sense. Would I've liked to seen them? I would have, but after a certain point, it is literally meet this character, meet this character, meet this character. To me, what I would have liked to see more of, and I think I said this on the podcast, was a development of the character of Saruman. And I think that they really hit great thing with all the casting. Christopher Lee's a great casting choice. The thing about Christopher Lee, if you've ever seen him in movies, other movies beyond this, the Star Wars and stuff, is he often plays the heavy, and he can do it almost just by staring at the screen, right? But Lee had been reading for years narrations of Tolkien's books, and not just Lord of the Rings, but Silmarillion. I mean, he has a great voice for that, and he can do a lot more than play the one-note villain. Which the minute you see Saruman in the movie, he's just Christopher Lee is just staring at him. I mean, I think my daughter said, "What's wrong with that wizard?" You know, I mean, the minute you see him, he's Christopher Lee, and he's got that look. But he was capable. If there's something I think Jackson kind of flubbed in that series, particularly in the theatricals, is he cut Saruman completely from the third movie, to the point that Christopher Lee didn't even have a name credit. I mean, they have all their, I think Boromir gets a name credit, and he hasn't shown up since the first movie. And they take Lee out, and he was such a big presence in part two that it did. But that aside, I mean, they clarify that in the extended versions. But what's still missing is a sense of Saruman as a character that's doing everything he's doing out of two things, which is necessity and fear, which again makes him more human and underscores Tolkien's point that when we see evil in the real world, it's often done out of necessity and fear, whereas there's a kind of malevolence that's in the Lee depiction of Saruman that develops over time. I mean, he doesn't stick Gandalf on top of the tower. He says, "Oh, he's our honored guest." He's trying to seem pragmatic. He's trying to draw him in. He does want Gandalf to join him. He wants to also feel the sort of like, hey, I was right, and you were wrong. He also wants to have the affirmation in his own troubled mind that hey, this other wizard has joined me too. They have like a disco fight in the movie, which is cool and all, but that to me is the one thing I wish there had been a little more nuance dealing with his character. Not because I believe he was a good, like that he was misrepresented. I just think that some of his nuances were things that Lee was up to the challenge of, but that we don't actually see.
Yeah, good thought. Kyle, I know you said you only read the book once. But is there something that really stuck out to you when you read the book, you saw the movie, that you were like, wait, I remember that, and that would have been really cool to see and have in there?
No, I mean, it was a long time ago for me, having read the books and then having seen the movies and all coming out. Yeah, off the top of my head, I can't think of much.
Or how about favorite? What really blew you away when you saw it, Kyle, or when you saw it, the movie probably coming to it kind of fresh? What kind of just impressed you or blew you away that you didn't quite remember was there, or that the movie had kind of shown in a new light?
The Oliphants.
Oh yeah, they were cool.
I mean, seeing that kind of stuff on screen was just I think what they really, really nailed in the Lord of the Rings series was just the world building. It was such a complete world, and you see it when you watch the extended versions. You see like the stuff they go into on Weta, the how much in depth they went on building this world, and I think that really set the standard for a lot of movies and a lot of TV shows to come. Like, this is where you're at. If you're going to build a world, we're not just going to accept this little cheap thing. And, you know, it's a fantasy series. And so everybody's got like, oh, they look like they made that wool from like, picked it up from Walmart or something. You know what I mean? Like,
Spirit
everything,
gum and the beard is coming off. Yeah.
right. Everything just looked, it was just really seamless. And it blended together. And you already mentioned how in The Hobbit, it didn't as much. There's a lot more, the CGI stood out, even though we should have had like this better CGI at that point. It just stood out like a sore thumb. It wasn't as seamless. That's what they did in the first 3 movies. And so I really enjoyed just seeing what you saw in the books come to life. And like Gollum, I think I was like, man, how are they going to put that character on screen? You know, Gollum is such an iconic character in fantasy. Like, people who don't even like read fantasy know who Gollum is. You can say "My Precious," and they know you're talking about Lord of the Rings. You know, and so I really love seeing Gollum on screen, and there's no end of memes. And I think for years, my friends and I were always like "My Precious" jokes and Gollum jokes, and the cultural moment. And Andy Serkis, I think, is going to play every live motion capture character on the screen from now on.
He's so good at it. I mean, he did King Kong and he did the Planet of the Apes movies. I thought he was great with that. The thing about Gollum, I want to throw this out there because this is an area where, not to sound kind of, I mean, you know, Tolkien put all the building work there and he made such an exceptional character, but there are things that Jackson brings into the Two Towers when he's dealing with Gollum. I think in a way, it's not that they're not in the book, but he visualizes and dramatizes them in such a way that make Gollum even a kind of stronger character than he is in the books. I feel like you are actually kind of, even though you know where he's going to end up, you're kind of really rooting for him to pull it together in the Two Towers, particularly that scene where he is arguing with himself and just the way he visualizes it, where he goes back and forth and he's coming to the realization that I don't need you anymore. And you know that he's setting him up sort of self for a fall because he's relying upon Frodo. You know, before it was the ring, but now Frodo's master, he's going to take care of me. All my eggs are in this basket. And you're just watching him, not unlike an addict. You're happy that he's getting out of it, but then you're like, oh, he's going back in. And that stuff's on the page, but I don't think it's as humanized. You know, like as at the end of the Two Towers, you're like, maybe he can, maybe this will be different. You know, maybe he'll throw it off and he's not going to take him to the spider. But you know, I don't know what your thoughts are, but I do think that was one area where I was like, wow, this is kind of an improvement. Not an improvement, but maybe like really using all the tools of the cinema to enhance something.
Yeah. Jared, what were your thoughts? What was something that you can remember from your reading that you were like, man, I really wanted to see more of this and bring that out have them brought that out in the movie?
How the Branding Bucks are portrayed. I mean, they're kind of a goofball character, like you were saying on the podcast. Like in the movies, they're just like Laurel and Hardy, whereas in the book, so far it seems like, hey, they're his trusted confidant and they're his trusted, best friends. And like, hey, okay, you need to go do this. We'll go do this for you. Okay, cover up the stuff from the Psycho Bagginses. Okay, versus so I would like to have seen that. Like what the other Nathan was saying, the slow descent into depravity that Saruman has in the books would have been just so enjoyable. Yeah, no, I think that's mainly the one thing I think that hasn't been mentioned is the more personification of the side characters than just
Yeah, good thoughts, definitely. Chip, you were going to bring up something with The Hobbit. What were you wanting to bring up with that?
Oh, I was pretty much in agreement with what you were saying earlier. I remember when he was making the movies, however long that was ago now, a few years back. and we heard that the movie was finally coming after all the waiting. I'm like, oh, good, it's about time. And then I heard it was going to be 2 movies. Okay, I can, he did essentially 6 books over 3 movies, and with The Lord of the Rings, 2 would make sense for The Hobbit. There's a lot to work with there. And then when I heard it was 3, I thought, he's gone George Lucas on us. I've got all this, somebody mentioned earlier about all the money to do it with. Let's just throw it at the screen and see what sticks. And I did think that the first movie was the most enjoyable. I've always thought that if you took the 3 movies and spliced them together, which I hear has been done, you can put most of the book in there and make a decent movie out of it. I did think the others went too far. I did not like at all the addition of the elf character. When I saw that and heard about that, I thought, why? You don't have enough good characters to choose from. Yes, you want young ladies to come. Yes, we know they can shoot bows and arrows. They've got their other movies for that. You could have left this one alone. But it just, the fight scenes that went on too long. The what was it? The white orc.
Oh gosh, that
was too much.
That was it wasn't necessary.
That was
at all.
That was the Jar Jar Binks moment for me. I thought, you lost me with this. I own the movies. I do watch them. I get more enjoyment out of watching them now when I distance myself from The Hobbit. Say, okay, let's just see this as a movie. And doing it that way, they work at a certain level. And there are enough fun elements to me. And you were just talking, Jared was talking about Gollum. To me, the most brilliant part of the Hobbit trilogy was the Riddle in the Dark scene. That I didn't feel could be done any better by anybody. I just thought it played out brilliantly. To me, it read and played on the screen like it did in the book. And that was very satisfying, actually, to see that part on film.
The moment of compassion too was handled well, where he doesn't, they make a big deal about his moment of compassion of Bilbo not kind of, in the story he leaves him, but it's like he has that moment he could knife him, and the way they handle it in the movie, he was, you're absolutely right, that was the best part of the movie, and they left it as a centerpiece.
That's one of the strongest parts of the Lord of the Rings too, is that Gandalf, being the wise wizard, sees the need for a Gollum. Frodo wants to get rid of him. Why do we want to have him hanging around? He's just holding us back. Well, you may find he has a purpose, which rings so true with our Christian principles. Everyone has purpose, and God intends some things for good and some things for evil. And I think Tolkien did that very well with his whole worldview, writing that into the story in very powerful ways. It makes a good point that everybody does have a purpose. Evil does. We don't like it. We don't like the coronavirus, what I'm hearing. But it's got its purpose, and it works out. Tolkien works everything out. Of course, there are about 1,000 other books now to support and backstory it. But I did think the strongest part of The Hobbit was that scene, which played well against what we learn of Gollum through The Lord of the Rings and the way we see him characterized. Very strong character. Yeah, it probably is. I think, Nathan, you made a good point. I think it was you or Jared that said, maybe somewhat of a stronger character in the movies than the book, but it carries the themes. It helps carry the themes of the story so well. So those were some of my thoughts on wrapping in The Hobbit with this discussion. One thing I thought, you asked about a scene earlier, I think more could have been made out of the mushrooms.
Yes.
Because I'm looking at the chapter now, I brought my book with me, The Shortcut to Mushrooms. And they have a little bit of fun with that, but in the movie, they don't really bring out how much that is to the Hobbit culture, to the Hobbit food feeding. One of my scariest memories from college, my wife and I still talk about it. That's where we met, and you just saw her wander through here a moment ago, Messiah College. I want to say it was either a Friday or Sunday night dinner. They decided to do a Hobbit meal. Everything had mushrooms. So that probably is why I gel and jump back to this. I came across this chapter reading a couple of weeks ago. I thought, oh, that awful. That was the only meal I had to leave school for, because neither of us at the time were big mushroom fans. We tolerate them a lot better now. But I did think there were certain little elements like that that would have been fun to bring into the Hobbits' lives and life story. They hit on it a little bit. Of course, the second breakfast thing is fun. I just saw that pop up in probably a meme or something the other day again. I hadn't seen one of those in a while. I thought, oh, wow, okay. So, so everybody listening to these go to 11 now and bringing this in. But so those are some of the things. Yeah, I think certain elements could have, the hobbits are such great little characters. Well, no pun intended, pun intended. Such great characters, they could have had even more fun with. I mean, you get a good sense of that. Merry and Pippin, or the fun-loving ones of the bunch. Frodo and Sam are played out to be the much more serious. By the end of it, well, anyway. Those are one of the things that come to mind. The Hobbit characters could have even been a little stronger. But Frodo, I think Kyle made Hobbit was a Hobbit. Hobbiton was Hobbiton. When you see that first scene in the movie and it's all green and you got the round door, it's like, wow, they hit a home run there. So, but yeah, a lot of it is just little, to cover 1,500 pages over 12 hours of movies, even with all you have, is hard to do. And the bottom line is we wouldn't be here talking about it if we didn't enjoy it immensely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I liked what you said about, the worldview, because it is easy with the books and the movies. You see his worldview come out a little bit, but I know, read so much about Tolkien. And I mean, I think we talked about it on the podcast last week. He absolutely despised allegory. He could not stand C.S. Lewis's works. And so, he was trying to distance himself and just tell a mythologist, just tell this ancient history of Europe and see where it went. But as you start to read the Silmarillion, you see more how his worldview plays out. You have the great creator who comes in and creates these lesser beings that also have the power to create, but he is still, Iluvatar is still the power over all. And he still has a plan and a purpose, even with Melkor, the dissenting angel. He can see all ends, and so you get more of that sense of, that destiny, that purpose, that there is an overarching control. And I thought, and obviously that those things were going to play into his life, even as he's writing The Lord of the Rings. He had this image because, you study him and you see he had been writing, parts of the Silmarillion throughout. And so you see that he had this view of, that there is a power overall that is guiding, and there is a purpose. And you get that from Gandalf a little bit, that while there are forces that are working for evil, there are also forces that are working for good. And so, it's just interesting from that perspective that, writers are going to write about what they know. And so as much as he wanted to, write this kind of original, and I think I've been reading some of his personal letters as well. You see that his goal was just not to write a word for word allegory, but we see the truth, from the Christian perspective of, God overall. And so, that truth came out in the story that he wrote, because he was writing about things that he knew. He's a very devout Catholic man, actually led Lewis to Christ. One of his most brilliant arguments that swayed Lewis, I absolutely love it, is, the mythology, the truth in mythology, and, talking about how, if you look at all the great myths in history, they all have one thing in common, and that is God coming to earth in some form to influence human life. And his persuasive argument with Lewis was Christ was the true myth. He's the one that we see God coming into earth as man, saving humanity, and that really stuck with Lewis for a number of years. And you can see how his arguments actually influenced Lewis's writings in his theology, which is interesting. And so one of the things that I really take away from this is not just the impact that he's had in terms of, you know, his writings and his writing in his fantasy, but you think of all that Lewis has done for the Christian community in his writings and his theology and influencing it. You know, and I've heard it said before, and I think it's true that when Lewis is on, he's on, and when he's off, he's really off. You know, he's off in some things, but when you read things like Mere Christianity, or God in the Dock, some of those writings, and you see, man, this is somebody who is influenced by J.R.R. Tolkien and his thought process. It goes to show the level of thinking and creativity he actually had when influencing Lewis in real life. And so that's one of the things that I really appreciate about everything that he did. Was it so saturated his belief system and who he was, so saturated him that it does come out in all of his writings. And so you have these very powerful themes of good and evil, and good conquering over evil, and the reality too that even though you're doing something good, you're not going to be saved completely from the evil. You know, Frodo, he went on this journey, and he was doing this good thing to destroy the ring, but it ended up consuming him. And he lost part of himself, both physically and spiritually, in this journey. And so, you know, Tolkien's realism in that is just fantastic, that he doesn't shy away from the honest truth that it doesn't get tied up all nice and neat and pretty at the end, that there is still a mess. You know, so that was one of the things that I appreciate you saying there, Chip, and bringing up.
I love that C.S. Lewis quote, the world doesn't need more good Christian literature, it needs more Christians writing good literature. And I think that's why, like, Tolkien hit and C.S. Lewis both hit home, is that they didn't just write good Christian literature, it was just good literature. Like, it was just good. And that's why it resonates with so many people for so many years and everything, even outside of Christianity.
Yeah, I think that's a thing that can't kind of be understated too, is that sometimes when you try to write like a good, it doesn't have to be Christian, but you want to write this thing and we're going to follow a template. And I think we can forget that Tolkien and Lewis, you know, they both were scholars, and they were coming, not that you have to be a scholar to do this, but this was the passion. This was a great desire. Whether you prefer one, I prefer Tolkien's story to Lewis's stories. But the difference too is that Lewis is very specifically writing children's stories with the Narnia books, and not necessarily with everything he did. But I mean, he is clearly writing them to a kid's audience as a you know, telling a bedtime story. Tolkien does take a sort of different approach. So the kinds of allegory that Lewis uses are a little more appropriate when you are telling that kind of story. I have issues with them. I have issues the further the series goes than I do initially, because you do a lot of Lewis's weird ideas start to come in, and his weird theological ideas enter in later in some of the books. But I feel like early on, the first 3 books or though, you know, those are very good and very strong children's stories. Not that they can't be enjoyed by somebody else, but I mean, again, it's hard to compare the two and wonder why one level of detail and one level of nuance doesn't exist in the other. But the thing is, you know, again, what we see today a lot of times is people trying to write within a template, you know, and that can be done. Kyle, I think you mentioned the Wheel of Time series, which is a really good fantasy series, but it is almost entirely playing in a world that is very much like Tolkien's. There's not really a lot of new thoughts in that Robert Jordan series. It's definitely worth reading, and that's a good example of doing something very well. And kind of taking some notes from Tolkien and adding a few of your own things. But yes, I find that whether it's Christian fiction or we want to write fantasy fiction, it's a lot of times it's falling back on something. And again, they were just trying to tell good stories. They were trying to tell stories that resonated to them, that spoke to their experiences, that encouraged them, and it ended up encouraging other people and speaking to, you know, the experiences of others and informing kind of that. And one thing I'm interested in is whether or not, so whether it be book or movie, favorite character, everybody's favorite character, and why. I sound like I'm like a fourth grade teacher or something now, but um,
Well, I'm fifth grade, so I know the question.
there you go. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'll start. For me, it was Legolas. I don't know what it was, like just the cool, like the long hair. He could crush it with the bow and arrow. Me and my buddies all shot compound bows. He had like the skateboard thing where he's like riding the shield down the stairs and
Right.
shooting arrows. Like Legolas. I mean, maybe it was just the age. Maybe looking back again and watching the movies again, I'd find somebody else I appreciated more. But definitely when the movies first came out, it was Legolas. Yeah, there were characters I loved in the books that in the movies that just annoyed me, but Legolas in both of them was just, he's awesome. Man crush.
Could I have more than one?
Sure.
Okay. So I'm gonna tie it back into like what the last topic of conversation was too. I'd say first is Sam. You can see a lot. He's the encourager, and you can see a lot of, I think, Christ in his character, and it was some intentional. Then obviously you have Gandalf the gray / white. You also see the resurrection. You also see him knowing a lot of stuff, and then as like Kyle was saying, Aragorn, because again, and I've read this somewhere. I think I also have like some book that kind of explains this from a Christian worldview type of book. That when you see Aragorn at first, he's kind of he's the second Adam of his generation. Something he's like, I don't want to be my dad, but I really don't know where I'm going yet. So yes, it's a bit flawed theologically, but you do see all about that. That I think the mission of Jesus in him to be like, okay, I'm going to set things right. I'm going to become the king. So, and plus, he's just, again, the born leader on the battlefield. So that's my theory. And like I said, I don't know if you can see that or not, but I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts about that. That's what I was talking about when I was listening to the podcast last week.
Yeah, I'd go with Sam Gamgee would probably be my favorite. He's the kind of friend you want. He's the kind of friend you want to be. He's there through obviously thick and thin. Never gives up, even when he's beaten down by his best friend. The one he's there to protect says, "You need to get out of here. You go home." I haven't gotten back to that part in the book. I'm waiting to see how that plays out again. I don't have that memory, but I'm looking forward to getting there in a few weeks. But I just think that's a great character brought to great life by Sean Astin, with a nice Baltimore connection, by the way, with his dad, who I think still teaches.
Yeah, he does. I looked into that last week. He's still,
he's still early 90s. But no, I just like the character Sam, and of course I gotta love Frodo too for some similar reasons. He winds up being a faithful friend, but I like the way he, even in the book, and it's played out so well in the movie when he says, "I will take the ring." One of the things that impressed me, going back to an earlier question, was just how many of the lines from Lord of the Rings show up in the movie. They were so true to that. And I know in watching, Kyle mentioned the extras that you get. We've watched all of the first ones, and they really tried to grab that heart. But Frodo not wanting to do this thing, but picking it up and doing it. And he gets the many wise words from Gandalf. Not all of us get. We don't choose the time we live in. None of us really want to do all of this, but this is a necessary thing that you're going to need to do to save the world. But he takes it on, and there's a lot of Christ-likeness in that as well. Father, if it be your will, take this from me. Frodo essentially says that many times through the book, but he knows he's got to hang on to that. Just like Christ did. I appreciated Jared's thoughts on that. There are a lot of little Christ-like figureness that play into the various characters. But those would be my two favorite. They're the two heroes of the story anyway, so why not? But both are so well written, very real to life, each struggling with things we all go through in friendship and in life. I almost wept when I got to the part of the Fellowship of the Ring, because it's where we are now. We don't want this pandemic upon us. It's only God's grace that's going to get us through it. So there's nowhere else we can look. And for Frodo, there's nowhere else he can look but getting that ring to the fire. And he almost fails at the end, but has some unexpected help from the one who didn't want to be a part of the story anymore long ago. But there it is. So everything just plays out so beautifully and so well. But you can almost pick a character and find a whole lot to like about him. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I'm going to throw out three of them, because I'm one of the hosts on here, so I can do that. The first one I'm going to throw out is Tom Bombadil, because his character is just it's so fun, and it's so when you read his scene in there from him helping Frodo and the others and who he is, and then you get a little bit more of an exposition about him at the council. It is just such a really great character. He's above all the evil, but he can't do anything with it.
Mm-hmm.
And they make that very clear that he's a character. Why don't we, and they try to do that, why don't we just give him the ring? Well, first of all, I don't think he would take it, and there's no way we could force him to take it. He's a creature that is from days of old. Their best guess is from the creation of time, if not coming out with time itself. And he's not interested in these matters. And I find characters like that so fascinating, because it's not that he's disinterested because he doesn't care. He's just disinterested because he can't grasp the ideas of this fight between good and evil. He can't grasp the stakes that are involved. He's so beyond all of those things that it has no effect and no play on him. And so his
And
character,
you can't bend him to your will if you wanted to.
yeah, exactly.
It's kind of like what Lewis says. Well, he's not a tame lion.
Right, exactly. And so that portrayal and that character, but he's fascinating too, because he's a character that's unaffected by it, but he's also a character that really can't do anything with it. He can't really, it's not that he doesn't want to, it's he actually can't do anything to help them. He has no ability in and of himself to do anything that can affect the whole of this scenario in Middle Earth. He has just enough good in him and power in him to be unto himself. And so that kind of fascinates me with that character, that he can resist the power of the ring. He can in some ways overcome the power of the ring, but he's so disinterested in power. He's so disinterested in what the ring holds. The comments made that he would probably put it somewhere and lose it. And then we'd be right back in the same situation. And so that character fascinates me, and I enjoy him for that reason. The other one, Aragorn, is, again, he was just written so well. His struggle and his development and his arc and where he comes from. And when you go back and you read the history in the Silmarillion and everything, what his lineage dealt with and who he comes from, you begin to understand even more that struggle and why he's as reluctant as he is to take on this mantle of leadership and to really to rise, which makes when he finally becomes king so much sweeter and so much better. And then actually the other character I really like is Faramir, Boromir's brother. And I'm going to say I prefer the book version because for another reason, this version is the opposite of his brother. We get a little bit of a different version in the movie, and we'll kind of talk about that later. But the book version, he immediately understands what's at stake and has no desire to take hold of the ring and do anything with it. And so be interested to do this again when you guys read the second book and you see how his character unfolds and develops. But Faramir is my third favorite character in there because of he's a strong character. In some ways, we get him on the outset as being strong, where we see Aragorn growing into his strength. And so his character as well is just really well done. And we see, these characters who understand other than Tom Bombadil, we see Aragorn and Faramir who just really understand what's at play here, and they want to see, this thing followed through to the end. And whether they succeed or not, they're going to be out there fighting on the front lines to try to get it to happen. So, Nathan, your characters, and then we'll jump back to Jared's thoughts about kind of some of those Christ characters that we see in there.
Sure, and I guess if we're talking, mostly the Fellowship, and it does differ based on the movies and the books, because in the book I'm gonna go with a chip and say that my favorite character was Samwise, and for many of the reasons that you already stated, again, that he is the kind of friend you'd want, he's the friend you'd want to be, and then there's also that element that in a way, as you go through the book, you kind of start to realize more and more that he is a very central figure, and he's almost as central as Frodo. And then and he's, while he's not blameless or faultless or flawless, he's the one who, Frodo does carry the ring with the desire to destroy it, but you also get that feeling in the book and in the film that part of it is also that he agrees to it not out of selfless reasons, but because the ring is compelling him. Whereas Samwise essentially goes, the dual reasons being he's going there because of his friendship and his care for Frodo, and Gandalf told him to. He gave him a mission, and he has that kind of simplicity of nobility to say, I'm not supposed to lose you, and I won't. And
don't turn me into anything unnatural.
The way you see that, right? But to see him carry that through, and it seems like he's moving forward in very straightforward emotions and actions. And when everyone else is getting caught up, even when he has his moments that where the ring offers the opportunity for temptation, it's the simplicity of what's driving him through that allows him to sort of undercut it. There's not a lot of complexity. It's, yes, I'm being tempted, but I'm going to do this other thing at the same exact time. Frodo's got some of that, but I think that that's what makes Sam such an interesting character. And when you kind of bring it back, and that is one thing that you kind of get when you reintroduce the Scouring of the Shire at the very end of the books, is you see both Frodo and Sam come back and have to do something. The truth is we've seen them do something for entire 3 books. We didn't need to see them come home and clean up the home turf. But it's interesting in the way they do it, which is juxtaposed against in the movie, that kind of weird moment. And I'm assuming that everyone's kind of read these books, so I'm going to the end. But, you've got that moment that's juxtaposed where, and my son brought this out, he's like, they were just standing they were standing in Minas Tirith and everybody was bowing at them, and now that they're being ignored for a pumpkin. Like when they're back in Hobbiton, they're back where they've traveled back, they just had the king and everyone bowing to them, and now they're, somebody's got a pumpkin over here in the corner and nobody's paying attention to them anymore. The hero is not appreciated in his own time and place. But so that character, and of course Gandalf is such a great character in the books. I actually, in the book, and I don't think you have to be the noblest character, the best character, or the kindest character or strongest character to be the most interesting character. I think that Boromir, as written in the books, is a really strong character too, because you do have a lot. You see a lot more of what forms him and what forms his opinions, and it isn't all daddy issues the way it sort of ends up being in the. Not that you know that as much in the first book, but you have the shadow of his father over their father, of both Faramir and Boromir, figure heavily into the movies. And it's less of a thing. It's more his hang up than theirs. It's more Denethor's issue than theirs when you get into what happens in the later chapters. But the way that Boromir is portrayed, and the level of where he has to deal with the fallout of making the mistake, right? Because in a lot of ways, he's the one who falls to the ring, except for Frodo, and then Frodo falls right at the very end, right? And again, as Chip pointed out, he has the Providence shows up in a form to save him, but there's that moment where it's like, oh look, Boromir, he couldn't resist the ring. If Frodo finds himself in the exact same place, just later on, but to have that moment where, what do you do when you mess up to that degree, and seeing him kind of come back and have that really strong moment. And so I liked what Sean Bean did with him in the movie and everything, and I think it was good, but I do think it lost a little bit of the nuance that made him such a strong character, because it's not as foreshadowed, I don't think, in the book. Going back and reading it, it's like, okay, there's a very, very strong sense of foreshadowing in the movie that yes, Boromir is gonna, he's gonna crack, and you kind of get that, but he's a different character. There's more of that Viking essence in him. He has that kind of like a character pulled out of Beowulf or something that. And then you see the weakness, and so I thought the way he was handled in the books was better. If I'm talking the movies again, it was a genius. The casting was genius all around. Casting Rudy as Samwise was was such an awesome choice, and I really think he kind of knocked that out of the park. If you get into, as we get into Two Towers and things like that, for me, a character I also really loved on the page, but I don't think was handled nearly as strong in the movie, was Eowyn when you get to the Two Towers. Conversely, while I thought Theoden was a good character in the books, I thought that Bernard Hill and the way they wrote him in the movies was really good. I thought once you get beyond the possession by Saruman, I didn't necessarily need all that. But when he comes to his senses, and particularly in the Return of the King, I thought the way he handled that character, this character who wants to protect his people, but there's this bitterness of, look, they didn't come to our aid, we're not going to go to theirs, and how that whole thing comes. I think that's largely down, it's to the writing, but also to the acting to Bernard Hill. There's a specific scene when the Nazgul is flying in on the battlefield in Return of the King, and he turns and he looks, and it's essentially his last big moment on the screen. There's just the sigh and the resignation that comes into his face when he knows where it's headed and what's going to happen, and it's just like it's the most impressive sigh I've ever seen in a movie, I think. So there are great characters all through, but those are some, if you're looking book and movie.
Nice. And so now I want to jump back because Jared, you brought up, the Christ images that we see throughout the story, and so I do want to touch on that because there's so many articles and books and stories written about these characters and the things that they build, and so I want to go ahead, Chip. I'm going to start with you. Let you kind of jump in and talk about these moments that you see in there and some of the characters.
Well, I mentioned Sam and Frodo. Frodo essentially is willing to sacrifice everything. Each of the hobbits, all of them have to leave their homelands. And that's a big sacrifice. And I'm sure that plays into the war theme as well. Just as Christ had to come to earth, you could argue that that's one of the Christ characters. We lost Kyle, I guess. Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. No worries.
Another junk call. Got to get rid of that house line. That's all it gets anymore.
We're about the same, yeah.
But let's see. Yeah, Aragorn, noble, the one who the last book centers on, the Return of the King. Again, very Christ-like figure. I think Jared did a good job at referring to him as the second Adam for his race. He comes back years after his father with a specific purpose from on high, something he needs to accomplish in his life. He needs to. He's the one that really holds the fellowship together, I think, at the end of the day. And he just, wanders in that great scene in the movie, Under the Hood, which we've talked about. But just trying to rally his troops. You could look at him, I look at him amongst the fellowship as being the one holding the disciples together. So you can look at different characters and thinking through it this way, which I really hadn't done before. It's a very good question. You can find elements of that through most of the characters, which is why God gave himself to us as a human. He wants to see our character through him. So through these guys, we get to see a little bit of those elements through each of them. Gimli, a great protector. Just wants to battle and keep everything at bay, and real quick trigger finger or axe finger, as it were. So we just go around. I want to hear some of Jared's thoughts on that too, but those are some of the ones that just come to my mind in thinking through it with that kind of view. I think you can make a case for each of them have various elements or gifts, depending on how far you want to push that. But they are, Tolkien wrote them very well, and as much as he didn't want it to be an allegory, sorry, J.R.R., it worked. You were so enmeshed with the gospel that it came through. So.
Jared, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't consider it Gimli at first, but I can definitely see that now. But I think even when you see Sam as the ultimate encourager, you see him going, Mr. Frodo, I will not let you fail. We'll get through this. I'm like, that's a picture of how Christ is the individual Christian when he's going through trial, or, when we're going through a tough time. Like, he's our advocate, and that's what Sam represented. I think the main one that has come to mind, especially like in the movies, is Gandalf the Grey when he turns into Gandalf the White after he dies in Fellowship of the Ring. Sorry, spoilers for those listening, but you see him again in Two Towers all of a sudden, unexpectedly, and he's in this white royal robe, and he's taking the throne, as it were, as the next High Wizard. It's like, well, that brings back the stories of the Second Coming almost. So that's what I was like, And I've always gotten just so super emotional in that scene. And then finally, I think for me, it's Aragorn, especially at the end of Two Towers when he goes, "My friends, you bow to no one," and they all bow to the fellowship. It's like, well, that's kind of a representative of Christians, like when we're in heaven almost. It seems like, like that we are now, we are friends of Christ, we are part of that family, and now, like, we and the angels and stuff like that as like that special people that Christ has purchased on the cross. So those are just stuff I saw.
Good.
Nice. Yeah. And when I look at that, one of the things that I think he did well, because this was, Tolkien really did want to write a book that it took place in a time before we saw Christianity. There were obviously gods running around in his world, in his universe, and we see some of the lesser gods in the movies. With Sauron, Saruman, Gandalf. These are some of the lesser gods that have been created in this world. One of the things that I thought he did so well, though, in achieving his goal of creating this world that kind of predates some of those things, is that there is no perfect one-to-one ratio for Christ in here. We see images, but they're flawed images, and that's kind of looking at the Old Testament. We see all of these prophets who came before, who represented, an aspect of Christ. We see David in the Old Testament as the great ruler, and Christ will come as the one true perfect ruler. And you see Aragorn as kind of fulfilling that role, where he's coming to be the king that will set up a kingdom, but we know his flaws, and we see his flaws. Even with Gandalf, we see him as a flawed individual. He doesn't retain the perfection and the confidence that we see in the true king, Jesus Christ. And so to me, that was kind of one of the things that I thought he did so well in showing a world that really wasn't centered around Christianity, was showing us examples of these figures, these characters that have a lot of similarities, a lot of these characteristics, but they're not quite there. We still do see the humanity in them, because I know for me, when I look at Christ, I can never live up. I can never, that's the benchmark. That's where I'm supposed to be, but I can't do it. But when I look at someone like Aragorn, I see, man, here's somebody who I can relate to, because I can relate to his flaws. I can relate to the person that he struggles to be. And so for me, seeing all of these glimpses and images, really it pulls in, what Tolkien was trying to do. And so I appreciate that about his characters. We see these, these Christ-like characters, which we saw in the Old Testament too. We saw all these Christ-like characters, but they always fell short. There was never one that rose up to it. And that was kind of the point of it all, was, and that fits into what he, how he wrote and what he wanted to write was, this story that just encompasses a telling of this history. And it is fascinating when we read Lord of the Rings. It does almost read more like a history book, and then you get to the Silmarillion, and it's just flat out a history book. But that's what I appreciate, is we can look at all these characters and we can draw these parallels of Christ and see, man, yeah, this is where they are here, and this is where they are here, and this is where they are here, but they never quite measure up. It's almost like they're still waiting for the perfect being and the perfect creature and to come and be that perfect ruler and leader. And so that's one of the things that I thought he did a great job with doing, is just doing, okay, we're going to write a story that's outside of this thing we call Christianity. And so here's what we're going to do. And because of who he was, you're right, Chip, he couldn't get away from it. But that is the essence of good storytelling, isn't it? Just it's writing the truths that we see. And that's the great thing about the gospel, is the gospel looks at, this is the state of the world. It is an evil world that we live in. But we see moments of redemption coming throughout of it, ultimately culminating in the great moment of redemption in Christ. And so, telling the story of evil and being tempted by evil. Mm-hmm. You mentioned, Nathan, with Boromir, his arc of, he was a good man trying to do a good thing. He fell short, but then he was redeemed at the end. And so, Tolkien's not afraid to explore all of these aspects of what we see in reality. So Nathan, you're going to say something there?
And I think one of the things that's nuanced and again, like we were saying, I don't think that he was setting out to, and he's kind of clear about that. And I don't think he was even trying to do it stealthily. I don't think he was setting out at all to write a Christian story. But again, it's what his experiences were and how he processed the things that happened. And it's important that these characters that there isn't one that is exactly Christ-like, because it would sort of imbalance everything, right? That some of the most interesting parts with even these powerful characters like Gandalf is, even once he's Gandalf the White, like probably one of the most interesting to me parts of the book is the moment when he's at Minas Tirith and the Witch King of Angor shows up, and it's the moment when his staff is broken. And it's a moment they add into the extended editions, but even in the film, it's just one more thing that happens. But he's sort of overwhelmed, and he kind of knows he is going up there. He's pretty much aware that it's not a clear given that he's going to win this, or that anybody is going to win anything at this point in time. And then, of course, when it's broken, the Witch King is upon him at that point, and that's when the cock crows, and that's when the light, the day comes and casts him off that way. And I think that elements like that all through, it's a reminder that, we don't have a all-powerful character, but there's always some sort of providence that comes in. And that's where, in that sense, it's not like Tolkien's hiding God, because he leaves open the fact that he does exist. He's not mentioned by name, but he exists, and he regularly shows up, as in that scene. It isn't always Gandalf coming to the rescue. At some point, somebody has to come to Gandalf's rescue. And that's there's never a point where that's not the case. Something too I think is really interesting is because, and if you look at a lot of the fantasy stories, it's always good versus evil. It's good versus evil here, but I think the kind of where, what Chip's saying is, like, I don't think Tolkien was writing allegory, because if you get allegorical, where his allegory will break down is, how do I create Christ in here without diminishing Christ somehow,
Mhm.
you know. And I think that's why he has an issue with the kind of lion. It's like, well, how do you get it where it's either kind of not right, or it's diminished a little bit, or it's too simple. But to me, one of the things that comes in is these characters aren't always making choices between good and evil. There's good and evil, but a lot of times it's also the nuance of wisdom versus folly. You know, it's things that which, when you look at maybe something through more like a Christian worldview, you start to look at that like, you know, some people are always asking, was it a good thing or a bad thing? And you know, I talked recently with my kids, and it's like, oh well, what about a wise thing versus a foolish thing? You know, we don't always think in those terms, and yet wisdom versus foolishness, and what appears foolish that sometimes turns out to be wise. You know, there's a lot of that in these books, particularly the first book, where there are characters that are doing things that look very foolish, and yet they aren't. And Samwise at certain times could be seen as being foolish when he sometimes sees clearly through everything else that's going on. And so when you have characters making those sorts of choices, I think that always is going to make a book more interesting. You know, what's wisdom to Boromir in the usage of the ring is really folly ultimately, right? And his fall is less about him being evil or choosing a good and evil, but failing to be wise in the face of a situation that could clearly overpower him. You know, there's a lot of elements of pridefulness. You see that in Denethor, and the foolishness or the folly of these powerful characters allowing themselves to be manipulated by the Palantirs. You know, touching into something that they know is dangerous, but hey, I can control this, and I'm beyond. You know, so I think that's one of the things that's really interesting, because you don't see that in a lot of fantasy fiction. Usually, often is, and not that there isn't good versus evil here, but there are so many other pieces of play that come into play in how the story rolls out that I just never thought about before. It's like, oh, you know, there's a lot about, is this wise? Is it not wise? And, you know, and even Gandalf, I kind of like Gandalf better when he's Gandalf the Grey, because he's so grumpy and so kind of free, that frailty, not the frailty, but the humanness of him early on. You can McKellen, I think, is a little more interesting as Gandalf the Grey, because you can see the weariness a little more in his eyes and everything. I think and you get a good bit of that in the extended edition of the last Lord of the Rings, when Gandalf has thought that he sent Frodo to his death. You know, I think McKellen handles all that stuff well. But seeing him again in the Fellowship as a someone who's really kind of tired, he's frail, he's not sure if he's going to be up to this, and which kind of is, it's juxtaposed against those moments when he faces the Balrog, and you understand again what you're really dealing with. You know, he looks like an old grumpy guy in a hat up until he's facing this fire demon, you know, across this gorge. And so things like that, I think it is all through the books. But the thing I think that's maybe impressive is that the strength of Tolkien's faith was coming out through what he was writing. It was organically built into him in such a way that was his worldview. And for better or worse, and the different ways in which that comes out, and there, yeah, you can find faults with everybody about these things, but I do think that even when, due to kind of when Tolkien is writing and his own experiences with things, and you know, people can point out, well, I don't know if he included this enough or included that enough. I still think that ultimately his books, even when there were flaws, they were still pointing to this idea of a common unity and a common, you know, for lack of a better term, of fellowship between everyone, and that the only way really through peace is through the, you know, through these mutual experiences and this overarching design that includes everybody. And so yeah, and in the book it's much more clear when you see the building respect and relationship that builds between, say, Gimli and Legolas is very different in the books. You know, it is something that is really two people understanding each other through a different lens. It isn't just we bonded over killing, you know, which is kind of the movies sort of are almost come down to that moment. They get a lot of nice moments, but you're still sort of like, okay, you guys learned that you could kill people good.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Well, we don't want to make sure that you guys have had a chance to kind of talk, and you know, so want to just kind of throw it out there. Any other last minute thoughts or observations, Chip, Jared? Anything else that you guys wanted to bring up and talk about?
I did have. Go ahead, Jack, if you're ready.
I forgot to mention about the limbus bread, what they used to feed themselves.
Mhm.
It kind of can be a reference to communion, although it's a Catholic idea of communion. But, you know, in some certain Reformed traditions, you know, it's also about like the presence of Christ being there with us. So that was a reference I forgot to mention earlier. But yeah, that's my
Yeah,
last thing.
that bread being, you know, life sustaining, and
Yeah.
again, you know, you get to the Silmarillion and you read a little bit more about. I mean, this was made in a very specific way, and it's the ingredients and the recipe for lembas was passed down, and it is an ancient tradition, and how it's made, and even who it's given to. It's not really just given to anyone. There, it's, you know, and so yeah, that's a great point, Jared.
And I was going to follow up on. Oh, hopefully, I've still got it. Well, Nathan's thought about Christ. I wonder, had there been one central Christ-like character, if the story would have been cheapened.
Yeah, and I kind of think it might have been. I think there was a wisdom there to.
Going back to, and I wish Kyle had still been on. I was going to make a recommendation on a book for him. I'll throw out to you all. But I kind of think that's where Christian art has lost so much of its potential impact. When it becomes obvious, non-Christians don't want to read it. But are you glorifying God by making it so obvious? You know, we've got His Word to show us the glories of God, the glories of Christ, on every page. We're not going to approach that in our writing, in our literature. Do we necessarily need to try? No, it's been done. But taking the elements of that and breaking them down, a beautiful story comes out. Every year for my fifth graders now, for the fourth year running, I have read, I don't know if any of you have read it, The Wingfeather Saga, Andrew Peterson. It's written for his kids initially. He started writing about a dozen years ago, finished it about 6 or 8 years ago, series of 4 books. And he makes no bones that his inspirations were Lord of the Rings, Narnia series, Indiana Jones, Star Wars were his major elements that he, you know, rumbled around his head. His kids wanted him to tell a story. So kind of like what Tolkien did with The Hobbit, just started in the hole in the ground that lived The Hobbit. Here we go. He's done the same thing, but his is more family oriented. It's a story of a family, the Wingfeather family. It goes through 4 books. The total of those books is also similar to this, about 1,500.
And this is Andrew Peterson, the musician?
It is indeed.
Okay.
He has long been one of my favorite recording artists. His writing is just, to me, nonpareil. And he does those things. He's so steeped in his own reading. He reads all kinds of classics, Scottish literature, George MacDonald, and so he's let those things, and of course, most importantly, the Word, influence his thinking and writing. I think you would all really enjoy it. It's at a different level than Lord of the Rings. It's for a different. It's written for an 8 to 15-year-old audience, but I've got adults hooked on it. I got the greatest note I've ever gotten from a parent last Saturday, because I read that to her daughters in my class. Her daughter now loves to read. She wasn't a reader when she got to my class, but something sparked this year. And for her birthday, the new versions of his Wingfeather Saga were just released. The first 2 volumes, the next 2 come out in September. But it's worth reading. It's very Christian oriented, but it's not
Right.
like this. It's not obvious.
Right.
But he makes very clear that the ruler of his universe, his world, is the Maker, always referred to quite lovingly and respectfully as the Maker, who's guiding everything. So it's a good read. He wrote a book last year, which I would have recommended to Kyle, called Adorning the Dark. Very worthwhile for you to pick up and read. It goes along with what we were saying earlier. Yeah, what Kyle's point was, you know, Christian writing from a Christian perspective, but giving glory to God. It's just taking your gift and using it for the glory of God. You don't have to be preachy about it. Tolkien is far from preachy, but we all get the larger themes that underlie a story because we know who he was now and have read his biographies and know about him. his Christian worldview. And Peterson takes the same approach, but it's called Adorning the Dark, and just how Christians need to do a much better job at being in the world, not of the world, being a part of the world, and creating good literature, good songs, good physical artwork. So really, really worth reading. I think you'd enjoy The Wing Feather. So Nathan's, what are the ages of your kids?
But I actually, while you were talking about it, Chip, I looked it up, and this looks perfect for my kids. Actually, my kids are 6 and 8.
I've read it now to. I'm sorry, I'll let you finish.
I was going to say my kids are 6 and 8. My 8-year-old has just really picked up reading. He's reading right now a series called Fablehaven, which it's a good. It's not a it isn't from the Christian perspective, but it's a good fantasy series. He's really enjoying it. It's Brandon Mull, I believe, is the author. But I'm looking at the Wing Feather Saga, and it looks like it's written about that same level, even maybe a little bit below. And we're just getting to where we're reading through classic fairy tales. I read them an adaptation of Beowulf the other night. So there we're building in all those baselines that a lot of these guys are using in their stories.
This would fit it right in for you. I can almost guarantee they'll love it. I've read it to a total of 45 or 50 kids now. And I'm always leery as to who's going to latch on. But the way he writes it, there's small chapters.
I just read an excerpt of it while I was listening to you talk, and it looks like
almost every chapter is a cliffhanger. It's amazing. But when I have to stop reading to get onto our real work, even sometimes even when we're headed to recess, can you read just one more? It just hooks them. I think because it's brothers and sisters interacting, fighting, bickering, but part of the story. It's just wonderful.
And the little excerpt I read reminded me, what more so than say, Tolkien or Narnia, it kind of had the feeling or the verve that came with something like, what is her name? Madeline Ingalls, the
Wrinkle in Time.
Wrinkle in Time, and the whisper through the door and stuff like that. Different story. But I could get that kind of feel, that kind of whimsical, here's a fantasy world, but what's operating underneath this fantasy world are these values and ideas and concepts. And I like that. There was also a series of books. Disney made one of them into a movie called The Black Cauldron that was the Book of Three. It was why can't I think that Lloyd Alexander wrote them? And it was now those were very much like stream off of Tolkien, but this looks good. I'm always looking for good
if you go
young
to
adult authors.
He has an organization that has its own site too called the Rabbit Room. That's where he sells all this stuff. There are a whole
I'm on that site now too.
Gloria
I've been moving kind of quick.
Yeah, Gloria Trafton. There's one called Henry and the Chalk Dragon, which is a book I haven't finished reading yet, but it's also good. There's a series called The Green Embers that's supposed to be very good. I've got a couple of them on my Kindle I haven't touched yet because you guys threw me this way. And then our pastor talked about Fellowship of the Ring in his sermon. I thought, all right, we're on lockdown. I'm going to read through these guys.
Nice.
So anyway, recommendations. But
thank you. I appreciate you.
All of you would enjoy them.
Yeah, no, I'll definitely check them out. I mean, one of the series that I really liked when I was younger, and I've read them again recently, not quite level of Tolkien, but actually it's a little bit better than Lewis in my opinion, and it's called The Chronicles of Anthropos, written by John White, and it's more allegorical like C.S. Lewis, but he incorporates elements of trolls and goblins. But it's interesting because it takes place in our world, and the way they get through Anthropos is through these different means and mediums. And so it's
is that the Sword Bearer? Like one of the books was called The
Sword Bearer,
Okay,
the Tower of Gabora.
Who's the author?
John White.
Oh, John. Oh, okay. All right.
Chronicles of Anthropos is the series. There are 6 books in that series.
They were like mid 80s, I want to say, is when they kind of came out.
Okay.
They were very much inspired by that like 80s fantasy, but I remember enjoying them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've gone back as an adult. Oh, I'm sorry, what were you saying, Chip?
I was going to say one more note on the Wing Feather. There's a short 15-minute film. They want to work that's available on Amazon. I think you just YouTube it. It's a 15-minute cartoon. They're working on developing that into a series.
Oh wow, nice.
Your kids will enjoy watching that.
Is that That's also the Wing Feather?
That's part of the Wing Feather saga, trying to turn it into a movie or a TV series. This is the first 15 minutes that came out about a year and a half ago. It's been available just as a teaser to what they want to do, trying to raise money.
Oh, well, they have some of the
Get a feel for the
read-alongs
characters.
on YouTube, by the way.
Excuse me?
There's the anime. Some of the read-alongs of the Wing Feather saga are
just-
on YouTube, so that's pretty cool.
He read the first 2 books he just read. He started the week of the lockdown.
That's
and
awesome.
Every night we get on to read, and I want to go back and I watched the first few, and once school really geared, I just had to move away from it and watch other things.
Yeah.
But yeah, to hear him read it is amazing.
Nice.
I might do that because I'll put like storytelling podcasts or things like that on for the kids at night.
They
to
run about
listen
30
to.
minutes.
Yeah, that's a perfect time. Yeah, I looked up about 30, 40 minutes.
Mhm.
I last week I just realized, and unfortunately I realized that the day that it happened that Andy Serkis was actually reading The Hobbit.
Hobbit,
You know,
yeah.
he read the whole thing. He had but by the time I found it and put it up on These Go to 11, he had just hit Riddles in the Dark, and I did manage to turn that on Friday. I think it was
Oh.
last Friday morning for my
Oh,
kids.
wow.
And he was just doing, which is, of course, for Andy Serkis, that's the main reason to see him do it right, is the whole Riddles in the Dark.
Right.
He was having a lot of fun doing it. No, yeah, thanks for that recommendation. I look
Sure.
forward to that. There was another series too. A lot of them are older series. I'm trying to think of what the total series was, but I think it was like The Dark is Rising. I don't know if you guys remember that one. There were 3 books, and it was The Dark is Rising, and there was I think Greenwich was another of the books, and it was a series. Susan, I don't remember off the top of my head. A lot of these were made into subpar movies, and post Lord of the Rings. So I think The Dark is Rising was actually a movie, but nobody bothered to watch it because it just wasn't. Susan Cooper was the author. And she had The Dark is Rising, and there's 3 or 4 of those books, and they're all pretty good too. They do kind of have an underlying tone of, not not allegory, but a certain element where you can see that there's a practical view of things that kind of come through a spiritual worldview that comes into play.
Mhm.
So I do look forward to reading those. Thanks, Chip, for the recommendation.
Yeah, Jared, I wanted to hear from you. Just ask if you had any recommendations, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, Christian fiction, but any good, fiction that comes to your mind of things that you've been kind of digging in on and reading.
Or movies too.
Yeah.
Whatever comes to mind.
Well, I mean, right now while we've been on lockdown, I've also been going through the Harry Potter series again too, because
Nice.
obviously what I've heard now is, well, I think you might have even said this on the podcast last week. That's why I've heard it. Is that what's her name? Rowling was very much influenced by Tolkien,
Mhm.
a lot of her writing, and you can clearly see that. So I've been reading that. Mainly on the movie front, there's this new Netflix show that I think you guys should do at some point. If I haven't gotten all the way through it yet, so I can't say what's really in there yet. But it's called Into the Night, and it's like it's this Belgian show on Netflix. Apparently, I guess like a solar flare happens. Or a solar event happens that kills a lot of people on Earth.
How
But
do I
there's
not
these
know about this?
But there's these people that are stuck on an airplane and they have to outrun it. And they just are
Okay.
trying to figure out like what's going on and stuff. So I'm like, it's pretty interesting. So that's the 2 things I got going on right now.
Nice. Good deal. Good deal.
Oh yeah, this look has a definite Stephen King kind of vibe to it. I'm already looking at the drama sci-fi series. All right, you got me. I'm sold. It's foreign? Is this let's see. It looks
Oh, it's got English. They speak
Belgium.
English in the
Belgium. Okay, cool. No, that's not a negative for me. That's always a positive.
show.
Because it means it's probably a little different, it's probably going to be a little. No, this is on now. This is on Netflix right now.
Mm-hmm. And the thing is, though, like the first episode, and I didn't see it, but kind of give me the vibes of that Nicolas Cage Left Behind. Like
Oh,
they
yeah,
do
I remember.
theirs.
I remember that.
But it's good though. And you're like, okay, I can buy this. So I'm on like half of episode 2 right now. So, yep.
Very
Yeah,
cool.
I'm sold. That all I had to do was see the title and the premise. So yeah, I will check that out.
That's awesome, guys. This has been great. We're coming up on 9 o'clock, so
Thank
2
you.
hours here, and really want to thank you guys for jumping in and joining us. Kyle had to jump off there, but had him on too. So this has been awesome. Chip, I was telling Jared and Nathan earlier, I'm not sure if I'm going to go ahead and take this and try to upload it as an episode or not. But I will. I'll kind of go through it once I listen to the audio and see how it sounds. We had a few more pauses in there, so. But this has been great, and we just wanted to do this, for a listener.
Probably try to do it again, maybe a little
Yeah.
more regularly, just to have connection with everybody. And
Absolutely.
Yep.
I look
So
forward to the Two Towers.
yes.
Yeah.
I just hit the part today about where Gandalf becomes Gandalf the White.
Oh, nice.
Just before this started, actually. Because I was
That's-
reading, I thought I got to walk away from my computer for a while, shut down, read a book.
I'm
That is
looking
cool.
forward to going back and reading this, particularly the Treebeard parts, because that's when you got to the movies.
great.
How are they gonna possibly
That was
pull
one of
that
the,
off?
that was one of the thoughts I had. It was
And
like,
I think
what are
they
gonna do with
nailed it.
Gollum?
They just everything about that. It's like, okay, you guys felt you couldn't do Tom Bombadil, but you could do this.
Yeah.
Oh,
But-
that's awesome. Well, in case we do upload it, we'll sign off with the customary guys. We just rocked the Casbah.